The buses stopped just short of the wire. Men in pressed coats and polished shoes stepped down onto mud that still smelled of smoke and rot. Women followed, some with fur collars pulled tight against the April chill, others clutching handbags as if they had wandered into the wrong street by accident. A few laughed nervously, unsure whether this was theater or punishment. None of them spoke once the wind carried the smell fully to their faces. The gates of Buchenwald stood open. American soldiers did not rush them. No shouting, no rifle butts. The restraint was deliberate. Patton wanted their feet to carry them forward by choice, even if every step felt forced. The silence did the work. It pressed on the visitors harder than orders ever could. Inside the camp, the dead had not all been cleared. Bodies lay where disease and starvation had finished what brutality began. Some were stacked near barracks, others slumped against walls as if they had simply sat down and forgotten to rise again. The living survivors stood apart, wrapped in striped cloth that hung loose on frames no longer shaped like human bodies. Their eyes followed the newcomers with a flat, exhausted focus. One of the men from Weimar covered his mouth. Another turned his head sharply away, as if refusing to grant the scene the dignity of his attention. An American officer stepped into his path and calmly redirected him forward. There would be no looking away today. This was not a spontaneous act of cruelty by a vengeful general. It was policy shaped by rage, disbelief, and calculation. Patton had seen death before. He had marched through the wreckage of North Africa, Sicily, and France. But Buchenwald struck him differently, not because it was the worst camp, but because it was close. Too close. Weimar sat only a few miles away, a city of culture, music, universities, cafes, and respectable citizens who claimed ignorance with straight faces. Ignorance was no longer an acceptable answer. Patton understood something many of his peers only slowly came to accept. The Nazi system did not survive on secret police alone. It required neighbors who chose not to ask questions, businessmen who profited quietly, officials who signed papers without reading too closely, and social elites who enjoyed their evenings while smoke rose on the horizon. The camps were designed to be hidden in plain sight, and Buchenwald was the clearest proof of that lie. As the group moved deeper into the camp, an older woman stopped walking. She stared at a pile of shoes near a baroque wall, thousands of them, mismatched, worn through, child-sized mixed with heavy boots. Her lips moved soundlessly. An interpreter later said she kept repeating the same phrase, "That's not possible." An American soldier answered without raising his voice. "It is possible. You're standing in it." Patton had ordered local dignitaries, industrialists, professors, party officials, and their families to attend. The selection was intentional. These were not random townspeople. These were people whose names carried weight, whose dinners had been well supplied throughout the war, whose connections had protected them from the worst shortages. If anyone could claim they did not know, Patton wanted that claim tested under the weight of evidence. At the crematory, the smell intensified. The ovens were still warm when American troops arrived days earlier. Ash clung to the brickwork, to the ground, to the soles of boots. A man who had once sat on a municipal council asked how many bodies could be burned in a day. The survivor beside him answered in a thin, steady voice. The number was higher than the man expected. He did not ask another question. Patton believed humiliation had its place. Not the cheap kind, but the kind that stripped away comforting myths. Germany, in his view, had wrapped itself in the fantasy of obedience and inevitability. Orders were orders. Responsibility flowed upward, never sideways. Buchenwald shattered that story. Someone had built it. Someone had staffed it. Someone had supplied it. And someone had benefited from the labor extracted from the people now reduced to bones. As they passed the barracks, survivors were encouraged to speak if they wished. Some did. Others could not. One man lifted his sleeve to show a tattooed number and explained how names were unnecessary here. Another described the morning counts, standing for hours while the weak collapsed and were beaten back upright. The visitors listened, stiff and pale, their earlier composure dissolving into something rawer. One woman asked why no one had rebelled. A survivor looked at her for a long moment before answering. He gestured around him at the towers, the wire, the guns. Then he gestured at his own body. "This is what happens first," he said. "After this, rebellion is a story people tell themselves." Patton was not present for every tour. He did not need to be. His intent was already embedded in the structure of the visit. No speeches about democracy. No philosophical lectures. The camp itself was the argument. The strategy aligned with Eisenhower's broader directive that German civilians be forced to witness the camps, not as punishment but as record. Denial would be harder when memory had been personally engraved. Outside, some of the visitors vomited. Others wept openly. A few remained rigid, offended not by what they had seen, but by the implication that they were connected to it. One well-dressed man muttered that this was all the work of criminals, not real Germans. An American officer noted his name. Patton's fury came not just from the crimes, but from the excuses. He had heard them before in other forms in other wars. The difference here was scale and system. Buchenwald was not chaos. It was administration. And administration required respectability. By the time the tour ended, the sun was lowering behind the trees. The visitors were quieter now, their steps slower, as if the ground itself resisted them. No one laughed. No one spoke of misunderstanding. They boarded the buses with the care of people carrying something fragile and dangerous inside their chests. Patton later wrote that the German people had to see, to know, and to remember because forgetting would be a second crime. He did not believe guilt was evenly distributed, but he rejected the idea that it belonged only to a handful of monsters. Buchenwald, standing so close to culture and comfort, made that impossible to argue honestly. The camp did not ask for belief. It demanded acknowledgement. And for those who walked through its gates that day, acknowledgement came whether they wanted it or not. What Patton understood, and what many Germans in those buses were beginning to realize far too late, was that Buchenwald was not an isolated nightmare. It was a node in a network. A place that breathed because thousands of ordinary decisions kept its lungs working. Coal shipments arrived on schedule. Accounting ledgers balanced suffering into neat columns. Local contractors repaired buildings. Doctors signed off on deaths with clinical detachment. This was not madness. It was order. As the visitors returned days later to their homes, the camp followed them. They saw it in empty shop windows, in ration lines, in the absence of men who would never come back. For some, the experience cracked something open. For others, it hardened resentment. They resented Patton, the Americans, the forced shame. They resented being made witnesses when they wanted to remain spectators to history. Patton did not care about their comfort. He cared about the future. He believed Germany would rebuild quickly, and that terrified him. A nation that could organize destruction so efficiently could organize denial just as well. He had no interest in watching the same faces rewrite themselves as victims of circumstance. The walk through Buchenwald was his attempt to poison the soil where that lie might grow. Behind the scenes, American commanders argued about the wisdom of these forced visits. Some worried it would breed bitterness rather than responsibility. Others feared it blurred the line between justice and vengeance. Patton dismissed those concerns with characteristic bluntness. He believed shame, when earned, was educational. The survivors understood something else. They knew that being seen mattered. For years they had existed in a universe where their suffering was invisible, officially non-existent. Now people with clean hands and full stomachs were forced to look directly at what had been done in their name. That gaze, however uncomfortable, restored a fragment of stolen humanity. One survivor later said the silence of the visitors was louder than the guards had ever been. Word spread quickly. Civilians in nearby towns whispered about what had been shown. Some claimed the Americans staged it. Others insisted the worst parts were exaggerated. But doubt itself was a victory. Denial now required effort. Patton continued ordering similar tours at other camps as they were liberated. He wanted a pattern, not a one-time spectacle. He wanted memory burned into geography. When people later said they did not know, there would be witnesses who remembered standing in the mud, smelling the ovens, feeling their stomachs revolt against truth. This approach clashed with Patton's own contradictions. He was capable of empathy and cruelty in equal measure. He was deeply anti-Semitic in private remarks, yet uncompromising in his response to what the Nazis had done to Jews and others. History would struggle to reconcile those truths, but Buchenwald stood as evidence that action does not always align neatly with belief. The forced marches through camps were not about compassion. They were about confrontation. American soldiers who escorted the civilians were instructed not to lecture. Their role was containment, not persuasion. Let the walls speak. Let the bones argue. Let the survivors decide how much they could give voice to their pain. Some Germans asked to return a second time. Others refused to speak of it ever again. Children who accompanied their parents would carry the images into adulthood, shaping post-war conversations in ways no tribunal transcript ever could. Patton knew courts would punish individuals. What he wanted was cultural memory. A nation haunted enough to hesitate before following the next banner that promised greatness without cost. Years later, critics would accuse him of collective punishment. Supporters would call it moral reckoning. The truth sits uncomfortably between. Those who walked through Buchenwald were not all guilty of murder. But they were citizens of a system that murdered, and citizenship is never as passive as people like to believe. The camp did not accuse them personally. It accused their silence. And silence, Patton believed, was the most dangerous weapon Germany had ever perfected. As days passed, the meaning of those forced walks began to shift. What had started as shock hardened into something more corrosive. The visitors could no longer tell themselves this was a single aberration. The camp refused to stay contained in memory. It followed them into conversations, into meals, into sleep. People argued over details as if precision might weaken responsibility. How many died? Who ordered what? Which units were truly guilty? The arguments were defenses masquerading as analysis. Patton anticipated this reaction. He had seen it after other wars, other massacres. People search for technicalities when morality becomes unbearable. That is why he insisted the tours include not only the most horrific sights, but the mundane ones. The barracks bunks stacked with bureaucratic efficiency. The storage rooms labeled and organized. The clipboards. The schedules. Evil, Patton believed, was most convincing when it looked professional. One factory owner from Weimar recognized equipment markings inside the camp workshops. His company had produced them. He said nothing at first. Later, he insisted the contracts had been compulsory. Later still, he claimed ignorance of how the equipment was used. Each explanation came too late to erase the image of skeletal men operating machines under guard. The Americans documented everything. Film crews followed behind the civilians. Not to humiliate them publicly, but to preserve the moment when denial fractured. Eisenhower had ordered it. Patton enforced it. The footage would become evidence not just of crimes but of awareness. Of faces confronted with truth in real time. Some visitors lashed out at survivors verbally, accusing them of exaggeration, of collaboration, of inventing stories to please the victors. Those moments were recorded too. They revealed how deeply propaganda had carved itself into ordinary minds. Even surrounded by death, some still clung to the idea that Germany could not have done this intentionally. Patton saw this stubbornness as confirmation that the tours were necessary. He believed war was not only fought on battlefields but in memory. Whoever controlled the narrative after victory controlled the next generation's willingness to repeat catastrophe. He did not trust abstract lessons. He trusted impact. For survivors, the experience was double-edged. Being seen validated their suffering, but it also reopened wounds that had barely begun to scab. Some felt anger watching well-fed civilians recoil in horror, knowing these same people had lived comfortably while the camp operated. Others felt numb, detached, as if the scene belonged to someone else's life. Yet many spoke anyway. They spoke because silence had nearly erased them once already. One former prisoner described how local children had watched them march to forced labor sites, how some laughed, how others looked away. He pointed toward the hills beyond the camp. "We could see the city lights at night," he said. "You could smell bread sometimes." No accusation was needed. The geography itself was an indictment. Patton's critics accused him of staging a spectacle. They were wrong about one thing. Spectacles are designed to distract. This was designed to linger. To infect daily life with questions no one wanted to answer. What did you know? When did you know it? Why didn't you ask more? Those questions followed Germany into the post-war years, into denazification hearings, into classrooms, into family arguments whispered late at night. Not because Patton was subtle, but because he was blunt. He understood that history rarely punishes indifference unless it is named and shown. The walks through Buchenwald did not create German guilt. They exposed it. Some of the visitors later testified at trials. Others withdrew into private shame. A few hardened into bitterness, convinced they had been unfairly targeted. Patton accepted all outcomes. His goal was not redemption. It was record. He once said that future generations must never be allowed to say this did not happen. That belief drove everything. The forced witnessing, the documentation, the refusal to soften reality for political convenience. Buchenwald became more than a camp. It became a reference point. A place people could no longer discuss in theory. They had smelled it, touched it, walked through it. And once you have walked through something like that, you carry it whether you want to or not. The war ended, but Buchenwald did not. It stayed alive in photographs, in testimonies, in the uneasy silence that followed whenever someone claimed they had known nothing. Patton moved on, reassigned, increasingly at odds with political realities that demanded reconciliation faster than truth could settle. Yet the walk he forced upon the rich and famous German citizens outlived his command, his controversies, even his death. Because memory, once planted, is harder to dislodge than armies. Germany rebuilt itself with astonishing speed. Cities rose from rubble. Industries restarted. Universities reopened. A new generation learned new words like democracy and responsibility. But beneath that progress ran a quieter current, one shaped by moments that could never be fully explained away. For many, that moment was Buchenwald. Not as a headline. Not as a courtroom exhibit. As a place they had physically entered, unwillingly but unmistakably. People often ask whether Patton's approach worked. That question misses the point. The walk through Buchenwald was not a program with measurable outcomes. It was an intervention in memory. It ensured that post-war Germany could never honestly claim total ignorance. Someone had seen. Someone had smelled it. Someone had stood there while survivors spoke. And because of that, denial always sounded thinner. Patton did not believe nations learned through lectures. He believed they learned through pain, exposure, and confrontation. He believed the most dangerous lie was the one that says ordinary people bear no responsibility for extraordinary crimes. Buchenwald destroyed that lie by existing too close to normal life to ignore. The camp sat near a city of poets and philosophers. That fact alone shattered the comforting myth that barbarism comes only from ignorance. It showed that culture, education, and refinement do not inoculate against cruelty. Sometimes they simply provide better excuses. In later years, as Holocaust denial surfaced at the margins of discourse, the footage and records from those forced tours became invaluable. Not because they proved what happened inside the camp, but because they proved who knew. Faces frozen in shock, revulsion, disbelief. Civilians who could no longer say this was Allied propaganda or enemy exaggeration. They had been there. That was Patton's real legacy in this moment. He turned witnesses into evidence. History is often kind to distance. Time softens horror. Numbers become abstractions. Victims become statistics. Patton understood this instinctively and acted against it. He forced proximity. He collapsed distance. He made memory physical. Critics still argue over the morality of forcing civilians into camps. Was it just? Was it ethical? Was it collective punishment? Those debates matter, but they cannot erase the central truth. Without confrontation, denial thrives. And denial is the seed of repetition. Buchenwald today stands as a memorial, but its meaning is layered. It is a graveyard, a crime scene, a warning. And because of Patton's actions, it is also a mirror that was once held up to those who preferred not to look. The walk through Buchenwald did not absolve survivors. It did not punish perpetrators. It did something quieter and more enduring. It shattered the illusion that horror happens somewhere else, carried out by someone else, beyond the reach of polite society. That illusion has been rebuilt many times since in many countries under many flags. Which is why this story still matters. Because every era produces its own excuses, its own carefully worded ignorance, its own comfortable distance from suffering. Patton's decision reminds us that distance is a choice, and so is looking away. The rich and famous German citizens who walked through Buchenwald were not chosen because they were the worst. They were chosen because they were the most protected by status, comfort, and influence. If they could no longer deny what had happened, then denial itself lost credibility. That was the calculation. Cold, direct, unapologetic. In the end, Buchenwald did what no speech could. It answered every question without saying a word. Why did Patton compel the rich and famous German citizens to walk through Buchenwald? Because history does not correct itself. Because denial is easier than responsibility. Because silence is never neutral. Because memory is the only barrier against repetition. And because sometimes, the most powerful justice is forcing the truth to be seen.